Have you ever found yourself unable to look away from a video of someone breaking down in public? A shouting match in a supermarket, a furious argument at an airport, a scene in a coffee shop that suddenly turns into a spectacle? Why do these moments grip us so strongly, drawing out a strange mix of discomfort, fascination, and even dark amusement? It is as if a mask suddenly slips, revealing something raw, unfiltered, and almost sacred in its nakedness. The collapse of a carefully maintained persona. For many, watching a public meltdown feels like stumbling into a modern-day witch trial. The camera replaces the torch, and instead of a village square, we gather in the digital plaza of social media. A single outburst becomes evidence, and the crowd judges swiftly. Yet beneath the laughter, the outrage, and the memes, something deeper is being revealed. These meltdowns expose not just the individual in crisis, but also the collective shadow we prefer not to acknowledge. Think of it this way. Most of us live with a persona built around control. We want to appear competent, reasonable, in command of ourselves. But under stress, that structure can collapse. When it does, chaos rushes in. Jung would say, this is when the shadow, those disowned parts of ourselves we try to bury, erupts into the open. And because it's happening in public, under the gaze of others, it becomes almost unbearable. We are not only exposed to ourselves, we are exposed to the tribe. What makes these moments both terrifying and magnetic is the paradox they reveal. On the surface, the outburst seems to be about something trivial: extra foam in a latte, a delay at the gate, a small request denied. But beneath it lies something archetypal: the collision of entitlement, invisibility, and the fear of irrelevance. In that flash of anger, we see a desperate attempt to assert identity, to demand recognition, to push back against the terror of not mattering. The viral figure of the Karen has become the symbolic image of this pattern. It is more than a meme. It is a mirror, a distorted mirror, yes, but still a mirror of our collective wounds. Behind the ridicule and the mockery lies something tragic: unresolved mother and father wounds amplified by the collective gaze of social media. And if we are honest, what unsettles us most is not how different they are from us, but how close they are. Because in their collapse, we sense the places in ourselves where control could also falter, where recognition feels withheld, where fear might push us into reaction instead of reflection. So before we dismiss or mock these public breakdowns, it's worth pausing. They are not just spectacles of someone else's failure. They are invitations, painful ones, yes, to see more clearly the fragile architecture of our own masks. And perhaps if we are willing to ask, what do these meltdowns reveal about the fractures in us all? When we look at a meltdown in a coffee shop or a shouting match in a retail store, it can seem absurd. How can something so small, like the wrong syrup or an item out of stock, provoke such rage? But underneath the surface, these eruptions are rarely about foam on a latte. They are about dignity. They are about recognition. And they are about the hidden fear that, without control, we are insignificant. Jung would describe this as the shadow, the collection of impulses, fears, and desires we try to exile from our conscious identity. The shadow of entitlement is not just about wanting more than others. It is about a desperate attempt to compensate for an inner wound, the terror of not mattering. For someone who feels unseen or unimportant, control becomes the mask. If I can dictate the details, if I can dominate this small space, whether it's a shop or a restaurant, then maybe I won't feel so invisible. Psychologists call this the gap between the ideal self and the real self. The ideal self is who we think we should be: calm, respected, in control. The real self is often riddled with insecurity, doubt, and fear. The wider that gap becomes, the more fragile the persona feels. And when it cracks, the collapse can look explosive. Control, in that moment, is not strength. It is fear dressed up as authority. This is why meltdowns are so disorienting to watch. They show us the collapse of a mask we all wear, the mask of being in charge. And they reveal the deeper truth. The more tightly we grip control, the more likely it is to imprison us. When our worth depends on dominating the environment, every small disruption feels like an existential threat. You can even feel this in your own body. Think about a time when someone interrupted you, dismissed you, or ignored a request you thought was simple. Did your chest tighten? Did your jaw clench? That physical tension is the body's way of signaling, Your identity feels under attack. Most people rush past this moment and react, but if we pause, we can see what is really happening. A simple path can begin with 3 steps. First, notice where the tension lands in your body: shoulders, throat, stomach. Second, pause long enough to breathe 3 times into that place. Third, name the fear under the reaction. I am afraid of being dismissed. I am afraid of being small. Naming does not erase the fear, but it gives it shape. And when it has shape, it no longer has full control. Consider the viral video of a woman shouting at a Starbucks barista because her drink wasn't made correctly. On the surface, it looked like entitlement, but if you listen closely, it was a plea for recognition. The words were about foam, but the energy underneath was, see me, hear me, acknowledge that I matter. That is the shadow of entitlement. It is the voice of a hidden wound crying out, don't let me disappear. The tragedy is that the very strategy meant to secure dignity, control, becomes a prison. It drives people into endless battles over details, rules, and minor slights. And the more those battles escalate, the less respected they feel, which means the cycle tightens. More control, more collapse, more shame. Seen through this lens, the meltdown is not just absurd, it is deeply human. It is a mirror of the ways we all reach for control, when what we really long for is recognition, safety, and belonging. Beneath the shouting, the slammed fists, and the wild eyes of a meltdown lies a storm in the brain. To call these reactions irrational misses the truth. They are not random. They are neurobiological survival responses triggered by a cocktail of chemicals and unmet expectations. Entitlement, in a neurological sense, primes the brain with dopamine. Dopamine is not the chemical of pleasure, as many believe, but the chemical of anticipation. It rises when we expect a reward, a confirmation, a small sign that the world is under our control. When the world delivers what we expect, the dopamine system rewards us with a sense of alignment and satisfaction. But when that expectation is denied, the dopamine collapses. What follows is a crash that mimics withdrawal. At the same time, cortisol surges. Cortisol is the body's stress hormone, designed to prepare us for danger. In an outburst, cortisol hijacks the prefrontal cortex, the rational, reflective part of the brain. When this happens, calm reasoning goes offline. Instead, the fight-or-flight circuits of the amygdala take over. The body reads the denied foam, the delayed boarding, the ignored request not as inconvenience but as threat. This is why the person in meltdown does not feel irrational from the inside. To them, the threat feels real. The status they thought they held, respected customer, dignified adult, has been stripped away in an instant. The nervous system interprets this as an emergency. Shouting, demanding, even lashing out become attempts to reassert safety and restore status. Seen this way, the meltdown is less like childish whining and more like the panic of an addict when the bar door is locked. The brain was primed for a fix, the fix of control, recognition, or compliance. Denied that fix, the body trembles with the ache of withdrawal. The rage is not only emotional, it is chemical. But if the biology explains the fire, it also hints at ways to cool it. The nervous system can be trained, just as a muscle can. Small, deliberate experiences of frustration, what we might call micro-denials, can build resilience. For example, choosing a longer line at the store, waiting without distraction, or intentionally delaying gratification by a few minutes. These small denials teach the nervous system that disappointment does not equal danger. Over time, the cortisol response weakens, and the prefrontal cortex stays more online. It is not about erasing the shadow or never feeling anger. It is about slowly building the capacity to remain present when control slips. That presence is the difference between an internal wave of frustration and an external explosion that becomes viral. When we understand meltdowns through this neurobiological lens, we can approach them with more compassion, not as freak shows of human weakness, but as raw demonstrations of a system overwhelmed. Behind every outburst is a brain screaming, "I am losing my place in the world." And in that scream, we glimpse the delicate balance all of us live with. A nervous system wired for survival, yet constantly colliding with the ordinary disappointments of modern life. In mythology, the queen holds a sacred role. She is the nurturer, the protector of the realm, the one who carries dignity and sovereignty. When that role is honored, she embodies stability and care. But every archetype carries a shadow. When recognition is withheld, when dignity is denied, the queen can fall. And in her fall, she often transforms into her darker twin, the tyrant. The public image of the so-called Karen is a modern reflection of this archetype. At her core, she is not simply a caricature of entitlement. She is a distorted echo of a once noble role. The fallen queen is someone whose power has narrowed to petty domains, who once sought to protect but now grasps for control. This is why these meltdowns strike us as both comic and tragic. Comic because the context is often trivial. Tragic because the energy behind them carries the weight of lost sovereignty. Nietzsche wrote about the will to power, the fundamental drive to shape one's world with meaning. But when that will is stripped of depth and purpose, it collapses into domination of the immediate and the petty. The rage over coffee foam is not about coffee. It is about a spirit of authority reduced to the size of a counter-transaction. In this narrowing, the queen becomes a tyrant. Yet even in her fall, there is a message. The shadow of the queen tells us what happens when recognition is replaced with dismissal. Many people carry this dynamic quietly, the ache of not being seen for their true contributions, the frustration of being reduced to roles that feel smaller than their potential. When that frustration builds, it can spill out in places that seem disproportionate. The supermarket becomes the throne room. The barista becomes the court. A question worth carrying is not, how do I avoid becoming like that? But, where in my life am I demanding recognition instead of cultivating respect? It is a subtle but important distinction. Demanding recognition places power in the hands of others. Cultivating respect begins within, through consistency, boundaries, and integrity. The first path breeds tyranny. The second restores sovereignty. The Greeks intuited this long before social media. In the story of Clytemnestra, her rage, when dismissed, led to acts that shook kingdoms. Today the stakes may be smaller, but the energy is familiar. Rage at dismissal echoes through suburban aisles and customer service lines. What was once tragedy is now reenacted in viral clips, but the psychological current is the same. When we see the archetype of the fallen queen, we are not just seeing someone else's problem. We are seeing a universal pattern, the collapse of purpose into pettiness, the hunger for recognition twisted into domination. And perhaps, if we are willing, we can let that image remind us to tend to our own sovereignty before the crown slips and the shadow takes the throne. There is something unsettling about how quickly videos of public meltdowns spread. They attract millions of views, ignite endless comment threads, and often turn strangers into symbols overnight. But the fascination is not just curiosity, it is projection. Jung described projection as the act of disowning a part of ourselves and locating it in another. What we cannot bear to admit in our own nature, we cast onto someone else, and then react to it as if it were foreign. In this sense, the Karen becomes a vessel for the collective shadow. She carries the traits many of us deny in ourselves: rage, entitlement, desperation for control, and expresses them so openly that we feel both appalled and relieved. The relief comes from distance. If she is the one unraveling, then we are safe from that mirror. We can laugh, point, ridicule, and assure ourselves, that is not me. But beneath the laughter lies a darker truth. Our attraction to these spectacles may be less about her collapse and more about our own denied impulses. Watching her burn with fury allows us to keep our own embers hidden. There is even a word for this collective enjoyment: Schadenfreude. The strange pleasure in another's misfortune is more than cruelty. It is, at times, an unconscious attempt to integrate shadow. By mocking the meltdown, we are rehearsing how to deal with our own suppressed chaos, without having to face it directly. But the cost of this rehearsal is high. Because in ridiculing the other, we avoid the harder question: where in me does this live? One way to approach this question is to notice the strength of your emotional response to these videos. If you feel intense anger, disgust, or even glee, ask yourself, what part of me might this be pointing to? The sharpest reactions often reveal the sharpest projections. The woman screaming at the cashier may reflect your own unspoken rage at not being respected. The man berating the airline clerk may echo your own fear of losing control. Pop culture has long intuited this dynamic. Consider the series Black Mirror, where public humiliation becomes entertainment currency. These stories disturb us because they reveal a truth we already live. The spectacle of another's collapse distracts us from the collapse we fear in ourselves. When we project, we think we are distancing ourselves from the meltdown. In reality, we are circling closer to our own. The viral video is not just entertainment, it is a mirror. And like all mirrors, it has the power to show us what we would rather not see. The question is whether we will use that reflection to deepen our awareness, or whether we will continue scrolling, laughing, and missing the message that the shadow is ours as well. Beneath the surface of many meltdowns lies a tension that is not only personal, but deeply relational. The demand for respect, the insistence on being heard, often echoes something older than the present conflict. It reaches back into family dynamics, into the earliest relationships that shaped our sense of recognition. This is where the mother wound begins to surface. For many, unmet recognition from early family roles leaves a deep imprint. A child who grows up feeling unseen, dismissed, or controlled may carry that pain into adulthood, searching for authority in places where it cannot truly be given. When that child becomes an adult, moments of being ignored in public settings can awaken the same ache of invisibility. The rage that follows is not only about the denied request, it is about decades of unmet recognition erupting at once. Jung described this through the lens of projection. Specifically, the projection of the animus, the masculine principle within the psyche. For a woman who feels her authority denied, the animus can turn outward as rage against men, institutions, or figures that seem to withhold legitimacy. What looks like arrogance or narcissism from the outside may, at its root, be a form of abandonment anxiety. The louder the demand for authority, the deeper the fear that it will never be granted. This is why the image of the Karen can trigger such strong responses in men. It is not only about irritation with controlling behavior. Often it brushes against their own unresolved mother wounds. A man raised by a volatile or dismissive mother may feel that same unpredictability in the meltdown he witnesses. The contempt he directs toward her may mask a more tender truth. The boy within him still aches for steady recognition that never came. There are stories that illustrate this dynamic vividly. One man on an online forum described marrying a woman who later embodied the very traits he mocked in Karens. Over time, he realized that what he despised in her was also what he had lived with in his childhood home. His marriage became a mirror of his unprocessed maternal dynamic. It was not until he named this wound that he could step out of the cycle, seeing her not as an enemy but as a reflection of his unfinished work. Seen through this lens, meltdowns are not only public spectacles, but invitations to recognize the way gendered wounds ripple through our lives. The demand for respect is rarely just about the present moment. It is the echo of early recognition withheld, replayed in adulthood, and our reactions, whether mocking, angry, or defensive, often reveal the unfinished stories we carry in our own bodies. When the mother wound surfaces in the figure of the fallen queen, the question is not whether she is justified in her rage. The deeper question is whether we can recognize the old pain that fuels it, both in her and in ourselves. Only then does the cycle of projection begin to loosen, and the possibility of new forms of respect, rooted in presence rather than demand, begin to take shape. The public meltdown is loud, visible, impossible to ignore, but often it is only the surface. Beneath the viral clip lies a quieter, more insidious pattern that plays out behind closed doors. Many relationships shaped by this dynamic do not revolve around dramatic outbursts in public, but around emotional hostage cycles in private. This is the silent trap of trauma bonds. A trauma bond forms when pain and affection become entangled. The volatility of conflict, followed by brief moments of reconciliation, creates a cycle that is both destructive and addictive. Partners caught in this pattern often feel they cannot leave, even when the relationship corrodes their sense of self. The chaos feels familiar, and familiarity can masquerade as belonging. It is not that the bond feels good, it feels known. In these dynamics, the shadow takes on a more intimate role. Gaslighting becomes common, twisting of perception so that the partner begins to doubt their own reality. Blame shifts like quicksand, leaving one person carrying guilt that does not belong to them. Small conflicts escalate, not because of their content, but because the relationship has become a stage for unresolved wounds. In this way, the private life mirrors the public meltdown, control demanded, recognition withheld, fear erupting as rage. Many people stay in such bonds because the nervous system mistakes the familiar chaos for connection. A partner raised in volatility may find the storm strangely comforting, even when it is wounding. To step away feels like stepping into emptiness, and emptiness can feel more terrifying than pain. The cycle persists, not because it is fulfilling, but because it echoes old rhythms of survival. One man, sharing his story online, described living for years with a partner who embodied this dynamic. Publicly, she was the stereotype people mocked. Privately, she mirrored his father's volatility, sudden rage, sharp contempt, followed by moments of affection that kept him tethered. It was only when he went no contact that he recognized the depth of the cycle he had been caught in. Breaking free was not about escaping her. It was about breaking his bond with familiarity itself. Awareness of this trap begins with observation, noticing recurring loops of conflict, mapping the emotional payoff, whether it is the relief of reconciliation, the adrenaline of chaos, or the temporary closeness that follows a fight. Then, testing small boundaries, not as ultimatums, but as signals to the nervous system. It is possible to step outside the pattern. Each boundary becomes a reminder that safety can exist without volatility. The silent trap reveals that public meltdowns are only the tip of the iceberg. What goes viral may be the eruption, but the deeper pattern is the slow erosion of intimacy in private spaces. And this is where the work becomes most urgent, not in judging those who unravel in public, but in recognizing where the same cycles echo in our own relationships, often unspoken, often endured in silence. By now, it is clear that a public meltdown is never only about the surface. It is not about the foam on a latte, the delayed flight, or the forgotten receipt. These are sparks, not causes. The deeper fire is always about identity, the fracture between the self we long to be and the self we fear we are. The figure of the Karen, for all the ridicule attached to it, is not just a meme. It is an archetype, a distorted mirror that reflects our collective wounds. We laugh, we scorn, we share the clips with friends, yet what unsettles us is not the distance between us and them, it is the nearness. Their outburst reminds us of the places within ourselves that are unsteady, fragile, or desperate for recognition. Jung often described the shadow not as evil, but as unlived life. The rage of the meltdown is unlived grief, unlived fear, unlived tenderness buried beneath armor. When it bursts into the open, it shocks us, but perhaps it also offers a chance. Like a cracked mirror catching the light, painful to look at yet strangely illuminating, these meltdowns reveal what we repress in ourselves. The question, then, is not whether we will continue to see these spectacles, because we will. Cameras are everywhere, and human beings will continue to fracture in public. The real question is how we will relate to them. Will we treat them only as entertainment, feeding our hunger for distance and superiority? Or will we use them as mirrors, however uncomfortable, to recognize the parts of ourselves that also struggle with control, recognition, and fear of irrelevance? When we choose the latter, something shifts. The meltdown stops being only a fire to watch from afar. It becomes a mirror in which we glimpse our own unfinished work. And from that glimpse, a different kind of authority can grow. Not the brittle authority of control, but the quiet strength of integration. So the next time a video of public chaos crosses your feed, pause before the laugh or the judgment. Let the mirror do its work. Ask yourself, what does this scene awaken in me? Where in my life does the mask of control feel thin? Where might I still be demanding recognition instead of cultivating respect? These questions do not excuse the behavior, but they transform our gaze. The meltdown ceases to be a spectacle of someone else's shame and becomes an invitation to deepen our own sovereignty. And perhaps, as Dr. Gabor Mate often reminds us, the behaviors that disturb us most in others are clues to the wounds that remain unhealed in ourselves. In the end, the public meltdown is both fire and mirror, destructive in its eruption, revealing in its reflection. If we dare to look into that mirror without turning away, what we find may not be comfortable, but it may just be the beginning of something truer. And so, I leave you with a question. Where have you noticed your own shadow tugging at the mask, asking to be seen before it breaks in public? Share your reflection if you feel moved to, not as a confession but as an act of recognition. Because each time we choose to see our shadow clearly, the cycle of ridicule gives way to the possibility of integration.